Okay, in this video, we're going to look at different ways of arguing. Now, the most common way of arguing in academic writing is pattern and interpretation. This is where you find a pattern in your data, whether that is a poem or a lab experiment or the results of a survey, and draw conclusions from that data, or tell your reader what is important about that pattern. You are probably most familiar with this method from your English classes. You read a novel, say Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. You see that Dickens uses a lot of Christian symbolism in his book. There is your pattern. And then you argue that Dickens is trying to, contrast the actions of the French Revolution with Christian values of grace and forgiveness. There's your interpretation. But the same principle applies to other disciplines as well. For instance, take this excerpt from a business case study. The part bolded is the interpretation, the part underlined is the pattern. Notice how we have a very different type of evidence than what you saw in Tale of Two Cities. Instead of examples from a book, the evidence is description of the business decisions and culture that Rogers has created. New product development has suffered. He moved division headquarters to corporate. Sales and marketing were separated with no consideration for their complementary nature. What is the interpretation of all this? What does this pattern add up to? The organization is misaligned, and Rogers has to take much of the responsibility. In other words, Rogers is about to get canned. So, very different type of evidence and a very different type of interpretation. Here, we are not looking to understand a novel like Tale of Two Cities, but trying to solve a business problem, like how to make sure the company doesn't lose money. And yet, the underlying moves of the writing are the same. Identify a pattern, interpret it. The pattern and interpretation method is more of a bottom-up approach. You dig around in the data until you notice a recurring theme and you explain what that theme means. The other way of arguing, the conceptual lens method, is more of a top-down approach. You start with a theory or a hypothesis, and then you see how well your evidence fits it. This method usually requires the writer to define their theory or hypothesis and then present their evidence and see whether that lens helps us understand the evidence better. For instance, you could analyze the movie Beauty and the Beast in light of the psychological concept known as Stockholm Syndrome. You would want to define what Stockholm Syndrome is. That is, a condition where hostages develop a psychological alliance with their captors as a survival strategy during their captivity. And then you would want to analyze whether what we see happen in the movie is an example of true love, or whether Belle is suffering from this condition. Or in a business class, you might want to use the conceptual lens of Clayton Christensen's famous theory, disruptive innovation, which is, quote, a process whereby a smaller company with fewer resources is able to successfully challenge established incumbent businesses. So basically, a small company is able to overthrow the big guys. You would want to use that lens to analyze, say, the smartphone market and whether established players like Samsung and Apple are at risk of being disrupted by your Vivos and Oppos. Here's an example of how to establish the conceptual lens you are using. This study of regional accents and racial stereotypes begins with a hypothesis that Southern accented speakers will be perceived as more friendly, less wealthy, more aggressive, and less intelligent than standard accented speakers. They connect this hypothesis to the broader theory that socially salient cues activate stereotypes, leading to perceptual shifts. This study has established how it will interpret the data of their study, focusing on how people perceive the wealth and status of those with Southern accents. That is the lens through which their data will be interpreted. Another way to argue is comparison. This is similar to pattern and interpretation, but here you are focusing on identifying patterns between two objects. This is especially common in the sciences, where you often have a control group, that is the group people or things you are trying to keep as normal as possible, and you want to compare that with your experimental group. That is the people or things that you are trying new stuff on, the guinea pigs. When you are comparing, you are identifying a pattern in your data, but the pattern you are looking for is how similar or different thing 1 is to thing 2. Take this example from a study comparing Riddle's Revolution football helmet with older models. Again, the part that is identifying the pattern is underlined, and the interpretation is bolded. Notice how the author is comparing the pattern found in one study with the pattern found in the other. Only 5.3% of athletes wearing the newer helmet suffered a concussion, compared to 7.3% of athletes wearing the older models. They are not interested in just finding out a general pattern, like how many kids got concussions in general, but looking specifically at how the data for one object compares to another. What is the interpretation of that comparison? The Revolution helmet protects the player better than the standard helmets. Since the pattern they saw was that those wearing the Revolution helmet suffered fewer concussions, the author concludes that the helmet is superior. Okay, to wrap up, the main ways of arguing in academic writing are, number 1, pattern and interpretation. Notice something in your data and then explain what it means. This is more of a bottom-up approach. Number 2, conceptual lens. Take a concept, theory, or idea and see how well it explains or fits your data. This is a top-down approach. Number 3, comparison. You look at the relationship between thing 1 and thing 2. How are they similar or different? Bigger or smaller? More or less? And how is that difference significant? Okay, that wraps it up for this video. See you on the next one.